Are there any other questions that you guys have right now, kind of for the Urban Institute on the housing needs, indices, or the opportunity indices, or even the neighborhood change that you guys would like? Ben, another question?
Yeah, I'm wondering about the physicians per capita. Does that include all physicians, or is there any, is it like, is primary care distinguished from like dermatologist versus a podiatrist, that kind of thing?
I can go back to the data and confirm, but we can follow up, but I believe it's all physicians.
Taylor is asking, in your methodology research on high housing cost burden, can you distinguish if the predominant issue is low household income, meaning incomes don't keep pace with comparatively low rents, or that high housing costs, meaning rents are high enough to strain even moderate to high income households?
Yeah, I can speak to that. It's a great question. I think, as Ipeng was saying, the sort of American Community Survey cost burden reporting just includes is all renters. So that would include renters at all points on the income spectrum. But I think by including both that measure and then also our measure that looks at the sort of ratio of affordable housing to very low income households, we would be able sort of to differentiate a tract that might score highly on cost burden, but it's because housing is really expensive, even for sort of moderate to high income households, from places where there's high cost burdenness and a high share of very low income households. So I think sort of taken as a whole, the measures will be able to differentiate that or those two different types of tracts, but just sort of looking at cost burdenedness in isolation as the American Community Survey measures it. You're right, it wouldn't differentiate between those two types of communities.
Ashley, your hand is raised, so I wanted to see if you had a question.
I do. So looking at the general occupancy housing index distribution and the senior occupancy housing index distribution, and comparing that to housing need index distribution, the housing need seems like a little less of a normal curve. And so I was wondering, in what way that you all might tweak this so that this data shows more of a clearer picture of the discrepancies that are going on in terms of housing need compared to what we see in general occupancy and senior occupancy. Is there a more granular, fine-tuned read that we could have?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you're completely right. The distributions look quite different across those three. I think sort of the reason why we think that the distribution for the housing needs index is skewed is because you're seeing sort of the disparities, that just the disparity is more significant in housing needs, that we have sort of these clusters of census tracts that have really, really high housing need. And so then by comparison, a lot of the tracts, have lower housing need than those tracts with more extreme, levels of housing need. So I think the question that we are now asking ourselves is that sort of an acceptable outcome for that tract or for that measure? In some ways, perhaps that is useful and that it really highlights those tracts that have really extreme levels of housing need and can focus on those. Or, for the purposes of how OHFA will need to use this data, perhaps making some adjustments to how we address outlier values could be valuable to sort of achieve a closer to normal distribution. So I think we are sort of asking those exact questions, as a research team, and appreciate your feedback on that as well.
I have a feeling that if I may follow up with that is where you're going to get a lot of your feedback from your constituents around the usefulness of that data. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Yeah, and I think because we've had a few discussions with the Urban Institute about this, kind of looking at how this data is being distributed for the housing need. And it's just like we don't want to really discount those census tracts that have very great housing need, right? We understand every area has housing need across the state. We're in an affordable housing crisis throughout the country, and Ohio is no different than that. But when we're trying to look at a scoring perspective on looking at how projects may be scoring in the 9% QAP, which may be different than how we utilize this index in other programs at OHFA. But just kind of keeping in mind that it's just that we don't want to, like, if we were to potentially shift the data, right, that it's just like we're moving that curve so that it is showing more of a normal distribution, it's then discounting those very highest need census tracts that are typically being shown from that map in the urban areas. And so we don't want to discount that at all and take that away from those areas, since the goal is to, based on the 3 primary scoring criteria that I've kind of outlined for the 9% QAP, that is just like housing need really accounting for 35% of an applicant's score, that is just like we want to make sure that those projects that are submitted in the highest need census tracts are actually getting more priority than other areas that may show less housing need. But again, we understand that there is a housing need across the state, but there are, when looking at it holistically, some have greater housing need than others based on the indices that were examined. And to Ben's question, so are we testing this data to see if this actually plays out as intended? I think that we are, I'll just answer this. So we're kind of giving it a visual look through, and I think that's part of what this public comment period is. Once we kind of, once I go through this, give you guys the link on where the OHFA maps are kind of located. It will give you guys a time to kind of examine, kind of understand and see how this is starting to play out for your communities. Again, we don't want this, like, we're seeing it 2 different ways, right? That it's just like we're trying to create measures for the statewide, whereas a lot of times applicants may be looking at site specific, right? That it's just like you're seeing if your deal is going to score in the future rounds. And so we're not wanting to look at that particular answer that particular way, but we want to understand that, does this make sense? Is this census tract that might be in your community, does it make sense that it has this level of opportunity? Does it make sense for that it has this grade of housing need based on your understanding and expertise in the area? Not necessarily if this means your deal is going to score high or not. And so we've already done some of those spot checks to kind of see, does this opportunity for areas, especially since I'm more familiar with Central Ohio, kind of looking at Columbus, looking at different census tracts there, on where are the higher opportunity census tracts, and to me, it makes sense on where it's kind of outlying, same thing with housing need, but we just want to make sure that that's kind of taken care of throughout the state of Ohio as well. And so that's what this public commenting process is going to be about, is for you guys to kind of assess the data that we have kind of put out there for public comment, to ensure that a lot of these areas throughout the state are being assessed correctly, and not, and so looking at that. Gina's question, also with the physicians, is physicians per capita based on census tract level may not make sense if the census tract is almost solely residential.
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. Yes, it is based at the census tract level, because we don't have, you know, data on for all locations of physician offices. So it's actually a pre-aggregate measure by a third party that's census tract level. Hopefully, you know, some of the other measures we have included under the healthy environment category could, you know, complement that measure. For example, we specifically look at proximity to primary care health centers. But yeah, that is the limitation to the data.
Are there any other questions, comments that we have right now on these measures? feel free to raise your hand or put a comment. Okay. Roy's asking, census tract level data should not be relied on so heavily because the market for a project is much larger and it skews the results. I don't know. If you guys want to answer that, I mean, I have comments on that as well, but you guys can answer first.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then Cody would love your comments. I think, totally fair. I think we have to pick some unit of geography that we can apply consistently, and I think census tract, makes the most sense. Census tract is often used in the literature to approximate a neighborhood, recognizing it's an imperfect approximation, and people's sort of self-perception of their neighborhood is not always going to align with like census tract boundaries. But again, I think it's sort of the best statewide sort of neighborhood measure that we have. So really what we're looking here is sort of the opportunity that someone who's moving into a unit or a building in that neighborhood would be experiencing. So sort of what is the proximate opportunity they'd have access to in their neighborhood, recognizing that folks might be moving from areas outside of that neighborhood to the affordable housing unit, but sort of wanting to capture the opportunity that they would have access to within their neighborhood. So that's why we're looking at census tract, and as Ipong said, that's why we're trying to pick variables that sort of have to do with the available opportunity in a given census tract rather than sort of the like people or the individuals who are living in that census tract, because we want it to capture sort of the opportunity that folks would have access to most proximately in the tract where an affordable housing development is located.
Yes, and to that, and I mean, Roy's also following up about zip codes are much more appropriate. I mean, I think that everything that Elena kind of spoke to is correct. We're kind of looking, again, we want a very data-focused methodology for these opportunity indices, the housing needs index, and the neighborhood change index. And so we are wanting to focus on a level of geography, as Elena kind of pointed out. The literature is always kind of pointing to neighborhood as being defined as like a census tract. And I know throughout OHFA's time, ever since like the Kerwin started introducing this opportunity index at the census tract level, we've had some limitations. We've also looked at discount to market rent that was at the zip code level. And so there were challenges there as well. And so I think that there's no real perfect geography to kind of use, but we have to see where this data is actually housed, right? And so since most of our data is coming from the American Community Survey, looking at the census, looking at census tracts makes the most sense for us to make these holistic decisions. We understand that, again, they're not perfect. Again, we see projects every day being submitted that may be right on the census tract boundary or right on a street is cut between two census tracts, and it's just like they're very different opportunity levels. We understand that that's maybe very frustrating for an applicant that is looking at that if you were on the wrong side of the street, right? But we, as OHFA, are trying to create statewide metrics looking at where the data is available and trying to create these metrics across the state. And so for us, it is looking at these census tracts that make the most sense for us on doing these analyses. So we have some granularity, whereas like zip codes may cover multiple zip codes, right? And it's just like not everyone that lives in a zip code has the same opportunity as, say, a census tract. But again, there's limitations to every geography, there's limitations to every data metric, and so we are just trying to create a metric that it has been based on literature, that is just like this has been a constant metric, census tracts as being defined as a neighborhood, and so continuing that methodology with this. Any other questions, comments? We have roughly like 50 minutes left. Again, I still have a few more slides on my end just to kind of go through next steps and kind of walking you guys through the OHFA maps, but happy to answer any other questions that you may have right now for the Urban Institute on any of the indices that were presented on or any specific metrics that you guys want answers to right now. Ben?
I would just like to make a comment and a suggestion. Generally, as you look at how this data plays out across the state, I would just encourage you to not penalize low-income neighborhoods and census tracts just because they have a large number of folks who are of low income. These are often the places where we most desperately need affordable housing.
Yeah, and I'll just say with that too, I mean, we have that in mind, or at least I do with the 9% QAP, right? Like we have that overall set aside that's looking at QCTs, so where there is a higher concentration of low-income individuals living. So they may not have the greatest opportunity, but they may show some housing need, but it's just like having a specific set aside to address that, right? That it's just like, yes, we are trying to target higher opportunity neighborhoods, but we don't want to exclude some of the most highest need areas that need affordable housing. And that's kind of the goal behind those set asides on looking at the QCTs with a concerted community revitalization plan. That it's just like if the community is actually working to revitalize the area, then we want to incentivize those areas as well in our QAP, at least on the 9%, and we can see how the other programs incentivize those areas as well. But we're not trying to discount those areas at all, but again, trying to look at different measures that have been identified in the literature on having the benefit of living in a higher opportunity neighborhood. So just kind of going through next steps, looking at this, so looking at our timeline for this. So again, we're doing stakeholder engagement. I've been kind of engaging with the stakeholders since January, a little bit before then as well, and kind of going through this early May period, kind of having this be like our last kind of formalized stakeholder engagement session here with the Urban Institute. And so just wanted to put a reminder up there that comments on these indices are due by 5 p.m. on May 23rd. And so these can be submitted to qap@ohiohome.org. And so the first draft, the goal of this, and so the reason why we kind of had this kind of quicker turnaround on the comments for these is just so that we have enough time to get that back to the Urban Institute. That's why we're having it submitted to qap@ohiohome.org. And so we will relay these to Ipong and Elena to take for consideration into potentially revising any of these indices. And so we want to get that to them so that they have enough time to work through that. And then the goal is to have the first draft of the 9% QAP kind of posted to our website on July 1st. And then I'll be presenting that at July board. We're just posting it before board to really hope to have this 30-day comment period so you guys kind of see on how this is all kind of written out. And with the finalized goal of having the final draft being approved no later than the September board meeting. This is really to allow you guys to have enough time for site selection, and so that proposals being due in February of 2026, and then final applications being due in September of 2026. And before we get in here, I'll just make a note about Nicole's question. So that is something that I am evaluating on the set-asides, on increasing the amount of projects being targeted for a QCT with concerted revitalization plan in the entire state. So that is something trying to balance that more. And so that is an area that I'm exploring further. It's just kind of looking at where we are at with our LIHTC ceiling, the number of boards that can actually be completed with the 9%. So just trying to find that balance on where we are at with the credit ceiling and the max credit awards and how many deals we can actually fund in a year. But yes, I am looking at increasing that from 1 to potentially 2, maybe 3 for that. So the next is kind of just looking at these OHFA maps. So I will just go ahead and copy this link and paste it in the chat. So that you guys have this available and you can start analyzing this now. I will say I'm posting this now just to give you guys an opportunity to look at this, but not really wanting to take questions on particular things that you guys are analyzing just yet. Save those for your comments to us, but just wanted to kind of outline on how this is kind of going. So again, this interactive map is really visualizing these geographic scoring of the neighborhood opportunity, general occupancy, neighborhood opportunity senior, housing need, and neighborhood change index in partnership with the Urban Institute. And so just again, this is a draft map for you guys. So it's just like, that's why the data is not made available. This is why just wanting to make sure that we are taking everything into account before making the data available to you guys, so that you only have one finalized set of data once we finalize everything. So when you go into this map, you will be able to highlight the different census tracts. You're also able to look at the different, the 5 regions. So again, this is really applying to the 9% QAP. So being able to look at the 5 regions in Ohio, and then you can start seeing on how these different indices are playing out throughout the state. And so when you are clicking through some of these, just keeping in mind, this is our color scheme. So again, this is different than what the Urban Institute was showing. We just have different color palettes. But basically, it's really showcasing the same data. So we're looking at greens and blues. And so the darker the blue, the higher the opportunity. And then the lighter the green, the lower the opportunity. So kind of being able to see this throughout the state and how that's being played throughout. So if you start to zoom in, you will be able to select a census tract within Columbus, and you'll see here on here that the opportunity index for this census tract is 87.27, and so you're able to just get that information, and then you'll need to swap between the other indices to kind of get what that opportunity might be. So you see here that it's just like the same census tract, the opportunity level increase between general occupancy and senior. Again, keeping in mind that the real difference between the two is just really looking at education. You will also be able to select on a different layer for a housing needs index. So again, kind of looking at the same census tract, seeing that the housing need here is 36.75. And then looking at the neighborhood change, that the same census tract is 50.63. So again, just looking at these from a holistic standpoint of the state of Ohio, comparing this census tract to the others, having this opportunity to kind of, for you guys to kind of look and explore to see on how this is kind of playing throughout the state. And again, we kind of have these different metrics in here, just kind of identifying our color scales. This will be modified before we get to the finalized version of these maps. So just take that with a grain of salt on how these are kind of outlaid here. These might be displayed differently, but it's really just allowing you guys to kind of see how these indices are kind of playing throughout the state of Ohio. So again, you're able to kind of go through each of these layers, click through, see how opportunity is kind of playing out in your community. Let us know if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns about how this might be for certain areas, on if there's any areas for adjustments or things like that. Just making sure that this generally makes sense for you guys that are more active in your community on how this is playing out. And so, and also, there's another thing. Just like, again, keep in mind on how the scoring's kind of being played out for each of this. So kind of keeping on how that's playing out. So it's like you take that opportunity score, multiplying that by 40%, multiplying the housing needs index from 0 to 100 by 35%, and that's kind of the collective score basically right now out of 75 points. to kind of see on how that census tract might potentially score right now. That's, again, kind of taking that idea on meshing these kind of together, looking at the raw score, so kind of incorporating those two decimal points after the score as well, taking that into consideration that these are raw scores that we are looking at for points. And so with that, that's kind of all I have left for you all for this. Again, we still have about 37 minutes left of the presentation. Just wanted to really highlight again that public comments on these maps, so once you guys have time to review, just do by 5 p.m. on May 23rd, so next Friday. Any comments that you guys do have, please email that to qap@ohiohome.org, and so I will be able to send that over. It looks like Kara has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to ask if there were any recommendations that the folks from the Urban Institute could provide if we're looking to engage our communities and having conversations about this. What are there articles that can help people, like easy to understand articles that kind of provide background on opportunity versus housing index need? I mean, I could provide that. Urban Institute is the expert here, so I thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I love that. So as Cody will be mentioning, we'll be, posting the slides and then also some more like detail on the method. I think that's not quite what you're talking about, but just those materials will be available if you want to, take those and use them, repurpose them for facilitating conversations with your communities. We can, put our heads together with the OHFA folks and perhaps see if we can share out some of the key sort of articles or pieces of literature that we think are helpful. Urban's team, the sort of dimensions of opportunity are developed sort of based on a really large body of research on upper mobility that the Urban Institute has been undertaking. And so there are a lot of resources that are available sort of through that body of work. So we can look and see if there are a few that we would just particularly recommend that are maybe more sort of high level, digestible, and we can sort of share those with Cody to share out.
Thanks.
Yeah, and just following up to that as well, just kind of highlighting, once we get more toward that finalized version, that's where Elena and Yupong will be providing us with a more detailed list, methodology document that's really highlighting all the finalized variables, on looking at the rationale, the direction that they are kind of playing out into the index. And so that will be coming at a later date. Again, it's since we're still drafting the variables, we don't want to put something out and again have that misconception between oh, well, it was included here but not included there. So just really wanting to highlight the final product once we have decided on everything. That's when those finalized documents will be published for that.
I just quickly comment. Yeah, love that you're working with your communities, and we have identified all these measures based on literature, saying what are the key factors and what the residents are looking for. But I think definitely the key is hearing from communities. We'd love to hear more. Kara, if you hear more on what the community sees are crucial opportunities for them.
Yes, thank you. And then we have a question in the chat from Jennifer. Can there be some scoring buffer for census tract directly adjacent to higher scoring census tracts with no geographic barriers between the two? She's showing an example from the new maps on one side of the street of opportunity index and the other. I will just comment on so from prior experience with looking at other things that kind of used buffers in the past, it's just we've kind of looked at proximity to amenities in past QAPs on utilizing buffers. And I think the issue with using buffers is where's the endpoint, right? That it's just we can say that it is, if your project is located, I think we've had buffers that range from 500 feet to a quarter mile to a half mile. I think some have even proposed even larger buffers for that to make your project work and score higher. And as we kind of saw in the tactical amendment that we basically put in there that there's no buffers allowed for proximity to amenities. And I think that that is probably the same track that we are going to go down with this as well, just because I think that it is harder to kind of we're trying to simplify scoring by having these 3 primary scoring categories. So it's just like you're able, one thing that I forgot to mention in the OHFA maps that I've posted, that you're able to search for a particular census tract, or you're able to type in an address in the top left-hand corner, and it'll take you directly to that census tract. And so it's getting at this simplicity aspect of looking at where a going there, and then that will populate an automatic field within your AFA that will generate the score for you. So it's just like, again, we're trying to simplify this. If we start adding in buffers, things start to get messy, and so it's harder to kind of clarify where things are. I get that it's, again, I know people are starting to look at their individual communities, looking at the opportunity index, but that's typically how OHFA has kind of viewed these buffers. It's just that we don't know where is the end to the buffer, right? And so it's easier for us to say that there's no buffer than to start scaling outwards with that. Nicole's question, in a quick look at our community, it would appear that the opportunity index is inversely tied to the housing need in much of the neighborhoods adjacent to urban core, low opportunity, high need. With the draft QAP, how will this scenario be viewed? Can low opportunity overcome the need? So that's where we are looking at kind of these scoring metrics, and that's why there is more of an incentive on opportunity in the current scoring metric right now, with 40% being tied to opportunity and 35% tied to housing need. I know that I've been tossing around the idea of a minimum threshold level for opportunity, but I haven't decided one way or another yet on if there will be a minimum threshold. Again, it's something that we've kind of considered, but really kind of looking at meeting these higher need areas that, right, it makes sense that it's just like a higher need area may have less opportunity, right? And so we think that that kind of makes sense in our minds from the literature. That these are kind of inverses, which is why we're trying to look at both and trying to incentivize, well, where is kind of the highest need area as well as the highest opportunity neighborhood, and looking at where that intersection kind of is. And those are the deals that will likely score the highest. And I don't know, Ipong or Elena, if you guys have further comments on that or not.
Yeah, I think just kind of what you said is exactly right. It makes sense that, you know, those two measures might point in different directions in some places. And so I think that's why sort of holistically looking at both factors is really valuable.
If there are no further questions, I'm sure you guys are busy looking at the maps right now, circling to see. There's one question. What are your thoughts about how projects in high opportunity areas can serve households that currently live in other areas? Lena, Ipong.
I mean, maybe I would just say, I mean, yes, I think that's definitely our expectation. And I think that's part of why when we were thinking about the measures to include in the opportunity index, you really wanted to focus on that sort of opportunity that's accessible to someone living in that tract. So more focusing on the environment than on the sort of individuals currently living in that tract, because folks might move into an area of opportunity through affordable housing being made available, where the sort of housing need and neighborhood change, you know, focus more on like the tract itself, to also think about sort of those incumbent residents living in the tract. So I think it would be our expectation that projects in high opportunity areas could serve households that live in other areas. I think maybe quoting the second part of the question of like how often this happens in practice, I would defer to you on that piece.
Yeah, I'll just say, back when I was in research here at OHFA, I was working on a project that kind of looked at residential mobility of our low-income housing tenants, and so looking at where they lived prior to living in a LIHTC property. And so I was finding that, yes, a majority of movers are making those short distance moves, but there were actually several individuals as well that were moving from greater than 5 miles away. And so I think we see, I think every resident is different in their circumstance, and obviously we want to meet the local housing need of that area and how it's demonstrated, but kind of understanding that people do move across the state for a variety of reasons, whether that's to increase their social network, be closer to family, whether that be for a job, so economic mobility, or anything other that they might be moving for. And so we're trying to capture both like localized need, but understanding that it could be serving need from other areas as well. Any last minute questions that you guys have right now? Well, I just want to thank Elena and Yipeng so much for your guys' hard work on these indices that you've created for us all. And so as a reminder to everyone, again, please take time to review this. We will be posting a recording of this presentation as well as the slides and a direct link to the map on our website. Some of it might be posted later today, some later in the week, but we'll hope to have those resources out to you again. So again, please submit comments by 5 p.m. on May 23rd and email those to qap@ohiohome.org. So again, thank you so much for joining today, and for Yipeng and Elena for your hard work and great presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.